Today, asbestos-related burdens, societal harms. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Our prior shows discussed the human burdens flowing from asbestos activities in Australia, and we concluded that the estimated death counts from asbestos-related diseases in Australia may have already surpassed 100,000, and that large-scale future fatalities from these diseases are inevitable in coming decades, especially under the current legal and other settings. But beyond the lives lost, the societal harms caused by decades of intense production and marketing of asbestos-containing products in Australia to governments, businesses, builders and homeowners and renovators will likely accumulate to tens of billions of dollars and possibly even hundreds of billions of dollars. Asbestos is a prime example of the capacity of corporations to make decisions that prioritise short-term profit gains whilst dismissing or discounting the future adverse effects on employees, customers and the broader community. So let's start with a quote from Jock McCulloch's 1986 book, Asbestos, Its Human Cost. The removal of asbestos is a hazardous and expensive process involving the use of sophisticated machinery and the constant monitoring of fibre levels. The removed asbestos has also to be safely disposed of, which again is expensive. Now we define harms to include any adverse financial or non-financial impacts on society resulting from a company's decisions or conduct. This definition is consistent with well-established corporate sustainability frameworks and is considerably more expansive than damages that might be compensatable under law. In these standards and in our content, impact is defined broadly to include the effects an organisation has on the economy, the environment and society, which in turn can indicate its contribution, positive or negative, to sustainable development. The societal impacts of legacy asbestos in Australia include, but frankly are not limited to, the following: the costs to compensate or care for sufferers of asbestos-related diseases. Second, the costs of research to find a cure or treatments for asbestos-related diseases. Third, the costs of communicating to the community about the health risks of asbestos and the appropriate precautions to mitigate these risks. Fourth, the cost to identify, risk assess and manage legacy asbestos in buildings and land, including government, commercial and residential properties. Fifth, the removal of identified asbestos threats in these properties. Sixth, the remediation of asbestos-related industrial sites. And seventh, the cost to landfill waste containing asbestos. Our research found no scholarly sources that discuss these economic, environmental and societal impacts in detail beyond item 1, and publicly available official sources on these costings are limited. Let's talk first about corporate externalities. The primary companies who mined asbestos and or manufactured and marketed materials containing asbestos in Australia are James Hardie Industries Limited, James Hardie we'll call them, and CSR Limited, CSR, and Wunderlich Limited, with the latter company being held within the James Hardie and CSR groups at various times. Today, James Hardie and CSR are highly profitable publicly listed corporations that continue to manufacture and sell building products in Australia and elsewhere. Our research suggests most of the societal burdens flowing from asbestos-related activity in Australia were ignored or dismissed when the mining, manufacturing and associated policy decisions were made. Today, most of those burdens are borne by taxpayers, the general business sector, homeowners and uncompensated victims rather than by James Hardie or CSR. In economic and financial terms, such costs are known as corporate externalities. Corporate externalities arise when a relevant corporation shifts the costs of harms caused by its actions and activities to persons beyond the legal and operational company structure. Externalities are common within the corporate world because companies that can force others to pay the bills for the reverse impact on society can enhance their own profits. This pattern of creating externalities can undermine free market arguments that the relatively unimpeded corporate pursuit of profit is beneficial for society and can justify more intense regulatory intervention in and regulatory consequences for harmful corporate activities. The scale of societal harms resulting from the mining and use of asbestos in Australia emerges through detailed analysis of academic and public data sources and from discussion with government bodies, companies, asbestos abatement professionals and others. Let's look at public sector costs. Australian taxpayers are funding bills to identify, risk assess and remediate or remove legacy asbestos from buildings and infrastructure owned by the state and federal governments, including from offices, hospitals, train stations, community centres, prisons and TAFEs. For example, in the 1980s, the removal of asbestos from a single building at Narrabundah College in Canberra was $700,000, and the Department of Housing and Construction confirmed that this cost level was representative of the asbestos removal costs in other buildings. Jock Matulloch outlines further case studies of asbestos removal from public buildings around Australia and concludes that in all cases the costs involved ran into millions of dollars. More recently, Northern Territory taxpayers contributed approximately $45 million to remove asbestos from 54 remote Indigenous communities. Taxpayers in the ACT paid approximately $3.5 million to remove asbestos from the Lyneham Sports Precinct. The ACT government and the National Capital Authority provided funding of $15 million to remove asbestos and to develop infrastructure on land in central Canberra that was subsequently sold. And Australian taxpayers via the federal government paid $31.5 million to remediate land on the Cox Peninsula that had been used for maritime communications and defence purposes, with asbestos management forming a part of the project cost. Gray and others concluded telephone interviews with asbestos removalists and assessors and environmental health officers across Australia in 2015. They found that removalists servicing government and commercial properties removed larger amounts of asbestos-containing material than those working in residential properties. Some of the removalists and environmental health officers highlighted schools and prisons of particular concern due to the age of the buildings. Others indicated that social housing often contained significant amounts of asbestos. Victorian taxpayers have already paid $379 million to identify, assess and eradicate asbestos in public schools, and this program is not yet complete. Assuming similar costs for public schools across other Australian states and equivalent costs for private schools, the bill for removal or remediation of asbestos in Australian schools may exceed $2 billion. The cost to replace or remediate asbestos from infrastructure sites and assets are high. For example, the states or their water consumers will pay an estimated $8 billion to upgrade water pipes containing asbestos that are now 50 to 70 years old. Further large sums are being spent by states and local councils to remediate industrial sites contaminated with asbestos and abandoned residential properties containing decayed asbestos, and to landfill asbestos waste. For example, the township of Wittenoom has been declared a contaminated site but has not been fully remediated because of the costs and difficulties involved. And in 2011, the New South Wales government provided funding of $6.3 million across 3 financial years to address the most significant health, safety and environmental issues at the Woods Reef mine. Dumping of hazardous asbestos is also a major problem. The Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency, the ASEA, estimates that 6,300 tonnes of asbestos are dumped illegally each year, and a commissioned study estimates that the associated costs at more than $8 million per annum. Common dumping grounds include reserves, bushland, forests, parks, near schools, on unused land blocks, in skips, and within demolition waste and green waste. Now let's look at the commercial sector costs. Large-scale costs have been incurred or will arise for millions of large and smaller private institutions and businesses across Australia, including corporations, universities, private hospitals, factories, utilities, and land developers. Since 2011, most employers are required under state-based workplace health and safety law to monitor and control in situ asbestos threats on a continuing basis. When interim management of identified asbestos is no longer safe for some reason, the capital costs to remove or remediate it add to the prior management costs. In a study commissioned by the ASEA, Byron and Tunney found that there is a strong business case for prioritised removal of asbestos from properties. Commercial participants indicated that the strongest factor influencing their decision to remove asbestos was a long-term reduction in asbestos-related diseases, highlighting the criticality of the value according to the saving of human life. Nonetheless, the study concluded that most businesses are opting for management of in situ asbestos and are deterred by the significant upfront costs of asbestos removal. We forecast that total costs for public and commercial bodies to manage, remediate and or eradicate legacy asbestos will reach tens of billions of dollars over time and possibly even hundreds of billions of dollars. Now let's look at the residential sector costs. On top of these figures, there are more than 10 million residentials across Australia, assuming 1/3 of those contain asbestos and a conservative cost of $3,000 to assess, manage and or eradicate identified threats in each of those properties. The total damages bill for residential owners will likely eventually amount to another $10 billion. The costs and sources of potential harm within homes is made worse by the use of asbestos waste in driveways, paths and garage floors. James Hardie sold asbestos waste or gave it away until the 1970s, and when in place it can be difficult to differentiate from concrete. So then the question is, what costs have been covered by James Hardie and CSR? Now, you may think that James Hardie and CSR should be responsible for all foreseeable harms caused by their actions and the associated research costs to mitigate those harms. This level of accountability has not yet occurred. In terms of personal injury costs, following an announcement by James Hardie in 2001 that it planned to move its headquarters to the Netherlands and restrict the amount of monies available to asbestos-related victims, the level of organised public protest and media scrutiny was intense and confrontational. This scenario pressurised James Hardie and the New South Wales state government and ultimately led to the establishment of the Asbestos Injury Compensation Fund, the AICF, in 2006. Under this fund agreement, James Hardie is required to pay an annual agreed percentage of its free cash flow into the fund for 40 years, with possible extensions applied if claims escalate. The 2020 annual review from James Hardie indicates that the company's cumulative contributions to asbestos compensation to July 2020 totalled around $1.6 billion. Most of this amount is likely to be personal injury payments paid through the AICF. The levels of personal injury and other forms of compensation paid by CSR and Wunderlich are not reported publicly. The notes of the financial report of CSR for the year to the end of March 2020 suggest these payments total less than $1 billion. If this estimate is broadly accurate, total compensation paid by James Hardie and CSR to the end of March 2020 totaled less than $3 billion pre-tax, with most of this money comprised of compensation paid to some of the people suffering from asbestos-related illnesses. The notion that all sufferers of asbestos-related diseases in Australia receive compensation is a commonly held myth. In fact, the present compensation schemes, including those funded by James Hardie and CSR, provide payments only when victims can prove their claims under the relevant scheme and this is not always possible. Claims data suggests very few sufferers of asbestos-related lung cancer receive compensation. The causal factors of this condition are complex and difficult to legally establish. There are also mesothelioma sufferers who remain uncompensated because they cannot demonstrate the required legal elements. These uncompensated victims must generally rely on taxpayer-funded health and other services, and the cost of these services are externalities created by the asbestos crisis. Let's then turn to asbestos disease research. The only contributions from James Hardy and CSR to asbestos-related disease research that our researchers are aware of was negotiated under the AICF. Under this agreement, James Hardy committed to contribute $500,000 per annum over 10 years to mesothelioma research. The beneficiaries of this money are unknown. In any event, this level of research funding from the industry seems minimal given the historical and ongoing levels of human suffering and deaths resulting from its activities. And turning to community awareness campaigns, neither James Hardy nor CSR have funded comprehensive national public health campaigns that warn about the risks of exposure to legacy asbestos and that provide practical advice on how to avoid or mitigate these risks. The only known contributions and efforts from James Hardy and CSR that seek to enhance community awareness of the risks and impacts of legacy asbestos were negotiated under the AICF. Under this agreement, James Hardy was obliged to contribute $75,000 per annum over 10 years for asbestos awareness programs. This money was used, at least in part, to assist with the establishment of a website with the URL of asbestosawareness.com.au. Our household survey results suggest the efficacy of this website has been limited. Its online guidance assumes that Australians are sufficiently aware of the dangers of asbestos to proactively search for and locate this advice and have the capacity to appropriately respond. Yet our survey found that more than 2/3 of the 43,000 household respondents could not positively identify asbestos as dangerous to health. And then there's legacy asbestos in properties. James Hardy and CSR are not paying for most of the property-related burdens arising from legacy asbestos, such as the cost to identify, risk assess, remediate and remove it from government, commercial and residential properties. James Hardy was aware of its potential liability for property-related costs and successfully negotiated for important concessions in the AICF agreement. This agreement states that James Hardy is not liable for claims for economic loss nor loss of property, include those relating to asbestos or asbestos product removal. James Hardy was also aware of their potential liability for remediation costs. In 2001, the litigation manager of James Hardy warned the company that the establishment of a broadly defined duty to remediate, whether at common law or by statute, could have a catastrophic effect on the company. The company or its lawyers sought to minimise these potential costs. The AICF agreement states that James Hardy is not liable for claims for economic loss or loss of property, including those relating to remediation. The New South Wales State Government further agreed in the AICF that it will not undertake any adverse legislative action or adverse regulatory action against James Hardy. The true nature and scope of this clause is unclear. In our view, this concession raises serious questions about the capacity of the New South Wales Government to act in the best interests of all New South Wales constituents, rather than for the benefit of James Hardy. The discussed concessions in the AICF were seminal and restrict, but may not entirely prevent the future capacity of the New South Wales Government to recover property costs associated with legacy asbestos. Specifically, the AICF agreement prevents or makes it difficult for the New South Wales Government to legally require funding from James Hardy to support the identification, remediation and the removal of asbestos from properties and or to recover other economic losses. While other states and territories are not signatories to the AICF agreement, the AICF pays compensation to sufferers of asbestos-related diseases across Australia, and not only to those exposed or residing in New South Wales. If these other states or territories were to attempt to claim for property-related costs from James Hardie, this arrangement may be put in jeopardy. Whether further actions will be brought to recover economic losses from CSR is uncertain. We're not aware of such actions to date. To the end of March 2020, James Hardie and CSR appear to have contributed around $3 billion to the legacy asbestos bill, mostly in the form of personal injury compensation. These companies have so far avoided paying for most of the other societal impacts, but this fact is poorly acknowledged in academic or other material. We expect the final societal burden of legacy asbestos to reach a minimum of tens of billions of dollars and may extend to hundreds of billions. More importantly, the steps taken by James Hardie and CSR to prevent continuing fatalities linked to or resulting from harmful exposure to legacy asbestos in homes has been minimal, with apparent reliance on a single website. So the question then is, who is bearing the costs of legacy asbestos in Australia? The concessions made in the AICF were highly material and forestall or make difficult attempts by the New South Wales government to obtain compensation from James Hardie beyond personal injuries. This legal outcome left New South Wales policymakers and possibly other state leaders holding an onerous pot of asbestos-related burdens and excruciating decisions about when and how to manage these. When the states introduced workplace health and safety obligations in 2011, large portions of the responsibilities, liabilities and costs associated with asbestos management and removal were effectively transferred to private employers. Although the public sector retains some of these burdens, the number of commercially owned properties and private sector employees to which the state-based regulations apply exceed those managed by the public sector. The politics underpinning the passing of the workplace health and safety laws that shifted the burdens of managing asbestos legacy firstly from James Hardie and CSR to the states and territories, and then subsequently in part to the commercial and employment sectors are important and intriguing. Our primary focus as a charity is to minimise the loss of lives from future harmful exposures to asbestos. One can argue that the legislated workplace health and safety obligations around legacy asbestos assist to achieve these objectives and are, on balance, justifiable. At the same time, these legal developments provide possible motivations for state and territory leaders to publicly suppress, understate, or ignore information that discusses the scale of the redirected risk, liabilities, and costs to commercial and private workplace settings. The laws with respect to the residential sector are incomplete and rarely discussed in public forums. Homeowners are responsible under the existing law for the control of legacy asbestos in their properties other than in workplace settings. And further, despite claims to the contrary, all costs to identify, manage and or remove asbestos in residential properties and any consequential reductions in the value of the property are borne by homeowners. And facing these charges and other adverse effects is inevitable. The only question today is whether these costs and impacts are borne by the present or future owners. As reflected in the household surveys facilitated by Digital Finance Analytics, most householders, include homeowners, are not properly aware of the danger and impacts of legacy asbestos and are not aware of their associated legal responsibilities. In addition, most are not proactively identifying or managing legacy asbestos in their properties, and most are not seeking advice from licensed asbestos professionals. Many therefore remain at risk of deadly exposure. Notably, the large-scale capital cost to remediate and remove legacy asbestos from properties across Australia cannot be avoided indefinitely, regardless of whether inbuilt asbestos is removed by means of systemic eradication plans or is left to be removed as buildings are renovated, demolished or deteriorate. That is, in situ asbestos will have to be removed from properties at some point. The only uncertainties are when this will occur, under what conditions, who will pay, and how many people will suffer or die in the meantime. So in summary, asbestos is a prime example of the capacity of corporations to make decisions that prioritise short-term profit gains whilst dismissing or discounting the future adverse effects on employees, customers and the broader community. James Hardie, CSR and Wunderlich continued to mine and mass-produce products containing asbestos in Australia for many decades despite repeated health warnings, compelling medical evidence, mounting death counts, and without adequately warning their employees, customers and the public about the dire risks associated with their products. The underlying cost-benefit analysis done by the relevant company directors and executives seemingly ignored the value of human life and the longer-term consequences and or calculated that the benefits would still exceed the costs and or assumed that future costs could be transferred to external parties. Indeed, asbestos is a classic case study of the ability of companies to shift most of the longer-term costs of their activities to external parties. Based on the publicly available evidence reviewed, the cumulative levels of compensation and other contributions from James Hardie and CSR until March 2020 to minimise deaths and mitigate harms caused by the legacy asbestos total less than $3 billion. Now, while this may seem a large number, the scale of corporate externalities associated with legacy asbestos is enormous and the ongoing bills are unrelenting. These societal burdens include, but aren't limited to, the health and costs of uncompensated victims, the costs of public health communications on asbestos risks and impacts, the costs to identify and remediate or remove asbestos-related materials from governments, commercial, residential properties and infrastructure, and the costs to remediate contaminated industrial sites and the cost of disposing of hazardous waste. We predict that these combined financial impositions will eventually exceed tens of billions of dollars and that most of these costs will be paid by taxpayers, businesses, homeowners and uncompensated victims. Finally, Asbestos Awareness Australia is a registered not-for-profit company limited by guarantee. It's a registered charity and has endorsement from the Australian Tax Office as a gift-deductible recipient. The company was set up to enhance public awareness and knowledge of the danger of asbestos threats, to promote measures and policies that prevent or minimise the harms from asbestos-related diseases, and to achieve these objectives, the company provides public access to widely sourced information on asbestos risks and impacts, including the associated medical, legal and political debates. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.